All right, and whose track was that? Did you know?
I think I've heard that track.
David, welcome to Stanford. We are so excited to have you at the View from the Top series.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to spend some time with you tonight.
So if it's okay, I want to jump right in.
Absolutely.
I was doing some very rigorous research, which started with a Google search on you to get ready for this interview. And when I typed your name, 2 options came up, which may or may not show up here. Oh, there we go. It looks like we have David Solomon Goldman and then David Solomon DJ. Naturally, I clicked the first, and that seemed, what you might expect. Wall Street CEO, sure. And I thought, well, why don't we skip ahead to the second here? I thought this couldn't be the same David Solomon. And then I realized that, in fact, I had the right David Solomon, but there were 2 versions of David Solomon. We have Wall Street CEO and DJ. If it's okay, I would love to explore both of those sides of you today in this interview.
You can explore both of those sides, and you can explore any other side that you'd like.
If there's a third, let me know. We'll get to it.
There are a few.
So we have an audience of mostly students. I would love to start to think about where you were as you sat in the seats that we're all sitting in, thinking about graduation from Hamilton College, considering your next steps in your career, and the extent that you had a plan or a journey you were going on. I'd love to hear what was going through your mind.
Sure. And, I think about that. I think about, who I was and what I thought about and what was important to me when I was a student at Hamilton College in the early 1980s. And I just say, for starters, the world was a very, very different place. I see it through the eyes of my 2 daughters who are now in their 20s. But their focus on what they want to do, where they were going to go, how they were going to build a career, what they were studying, how it was connected as undergraduate students, and now one of them is a graduate student. It was just at a completely different level of both focus and maturity than mine was. When I was sitting in the seat at Hamilton College, if I'm honest, I'm not sure that I would have come to see the CEO of Goldman Sachs speak if the CEO of Goldman Sachs was ever on the Hamilton College campus, which, well, actually, he might have been. Hamilton College has a great legacy of Goldman Sachs partners, and so who knows? But it was probably unlikely. But I was going through school. I thought I wanted to go to law school. My parents, particularly my mother, had a view that you had to have a profession. And to her, there was a profession, and then there was a secondary profession if you weren't going to pursue the first profession. The profession, for a nice Jewish boy who grew up in Westchester County, was he had to go to medical school and you had to be a doctor. That was the profession. When it was clear that I was going to work through 4 years of Hamilton College without taking a physical science, that would probably exclude medical school as something that I could seriously consider. There was then an open door to the second profession, which was law school. And somehow I kind of went through Hamilton College as an economics major, history minor, thinking that I would go to law school. But somehow I kind of stumbled into working in finance. And I think it really came from the fact, and it's kind of interesting because I look at myself and I think about myself and the way I'm wired. I was more of a follower when I was kind of thinking about this stuff coming out of school. It was the early 80s. Wall Street really hadn't exploded. If you're a student of finance, the history of finance, the 1960s, 70s, into the early 80s, finance was really nowhere. The stock market went nowhere for a long period of time. The businesses were small, niche-y businesses. But in the early 80s, the banks were starting to hire people. The concept of an analyst program was created in the early 80s, right when I was getting out of school. And it was this opportunity to go to work for what was a very, very nice wage, live in New York with your friends, and get a further education. And so I applied to Goldman Sachs, didn't get a job. Applied to a number of places, didn't get a job. I wound up getting a job at the Irving Trust Company, which was a commercial bank. I really had no idea what a commercial bank did. It wasn't necessary in that day and age to be as sophisticated and knowledgeable. You were really interviewed at that point in time as to who you were. not what you knew about the profession you were trying to pursue. And so I wound up with a job at the Irving Trust Company. It was $22,500 a year, which seemed like a monstrous amount of money coming out of college. It allowed me to live in New York City with a few of my college buddies, and off I went. And I'd say I stumbled into it, and I really had no idea that I would pursue a career in finance, but it was a job, and I needed a job.
And in those early years, you moved to firms that were giants on Wall Street at the time, from Drexel Burnham to Bear Stearns later. There's somewhat of an irony here.
Developing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a pattern here where those firms were the place you went to work if you could really make it on Wall Street at the time. Today, they don't exist. What do you take from that when you look back on that experience, both of hopping around, but also being at places that everyone thought would last the test of time?
Well, Wall Street, if you're a student of the history of finance and Wall Street is a giant graveyard of firms that have gone out of business. Financial firms are generally levered entities, and history is filled with financial firms that have gone away. I happen to work at two of them, and I mean, we get to the story as to how I wound up there. It's actually interesting because I came out of Hamilton College. I didn't have a business background. In the early 1980s, if you were working on Wall Street, the way the model was set up is you worked for 2 years as an analyst, and then you were fired, and you had to go back to business school. You had to go to graduate school. 98% of the people that are my generation in finance went to business school. I was applying to business school in 1985 and was sure I was going to go back to business school because I decided, hey, this finance thing's kind of interesting. I'd like to go back to business school. Again, as a little bit of a follower, all my friends were applying to business school. And while I was applying at a cocktail party, I met a headhunter, a guy whose name is Gary Goldstein, who had a firm called the Whitney Group, still exists. I mean, he's still a headhunter in New York City. At a cocktail party, and he talked to me for 20 minutes, and he said, I have to introduce you to somebody. And he went and he introduced me to somebody at Drexel Burnham. And at the time, Mike Milken's junk bond business was, kind of, rising to the peak of what it would become. And because junk bonds dealt with the credit of companies, I had a credit training, a formal credit training at a bank. There was a group that was part of the junk bond business there that was hiring liberal arts majors because they thought they had great communication skills, that had worked at banks and had credit backgrounds so they could actually sell and talk about these securities. And I got hired to work at Drexel Burnham, and the salary they were offering was basically a salary package that was ahead of what I would get if I went to business school and came out and got an entry-level job outside of, after business school. So I remember talking to my dad about it. My dad was like, look, go give it a try. It's a hot firm at the moment. Doesn't mean it'll be a hot firm forever, I remember him saying. And he said, but if it doesn't work out after a couple of years, you're still young enough, you can go back to school if you want. And so I went off and started working at Drexel Burnham. It was a really interesting experience. It had a lot of rope. It was very entrepreneurial. It was very open. Wall Street in the 1980s was kind of the entrepreneurial tech environment, if you want to make a comparison in some ways. And it just kind of worked, and I did very, very well. But what didn't work is Mike Milken went to jail, and ultimately in 1990, Drexel Burnham went out of business. But there was a lot of really good stuff at Drexel Burnham. But boy, I learned a lot of lessons about what can go wrong, in a financial services firm. And so suddenly in 1990, I was out of a job. I hadn't been to business school, and you had to forge ahead. But it was a great learning experience. It was a humbling experience. But I think net was a positive experience. It was a good decision.
Was there questions in your family when you didn't go the path of medicine at that time?
Well, my mom. There were all sorts of questions with my mom. Unfortunately, neither of my parents are still around. And actually, one of the things that I really, both of them died in their 70s, and one of the things that I really regret is, they watched me for a good portion of my career, and I wish they were around so that I could share with them, some of what I'm experiencing today. But there were a lot of things with my mom. My mom didn't like that I didn't pursue a profession. My mom didn't like that I was a Jewish boy who married a Catholic girl. My mom didn't like the fact that I wanted to have a wedding on Saturday night that started before the sun went down. I mean, there were a lot of things with my mom that didn't quite jive. But I think she loved me unconditionally. But you know, she made it clear, you know, what she thought about the various choices.
I remember that reminds me of my grandmother when I went to liberal arts school and studied government. I hadn't yet told her I was going to study government. And she said, honey, tell me what you're going to study. I'm not going to judge you. I won't say, how are you going to get a job? You know, just tell me what you're thinking. I said, well, Grandma, I think I'm going to study government. She said, how are you going to get a job when you study government? So there's real family pressures to follow the path.
There definitely are family pressures. Everybody has family pressures.
Yeah.
You've got to, you know, for my mom, for all the pressure she put, you know, she definitely, there are a bunch of things about my motivation and my drive that clearly come from my mom. And she, you know, she somehow translated kind of a spirit of discipline that has helped me enormously, you know, professionally and personally, you know, at times. You know, my dad gave me a whole bunch of other things that I appreciate, especially, you know, with respect to really enjoying life and living life to the fullest. But they were a great combination, and you know, both had a profound impact on me, shaping me professionally, personally, in ways that I only appreciate now, you know, that I miss them and they're gone.
Looking ahead a few years, when you went into Goldman as a lateral hire, so you didn't go through the ranks, obviously, it wasn't clear, or at least to me it wasn't clear, what the path forward you felt would be and where you would go from there when you joined the firm. That wasn't the way to go from what it seemed like at the time. What was going through your mind and what made that decision work for you?
You skip Bear Stearns, which I think is something that's worth just touching on for a minute, because Bear Stearns was a pretty meaningful firm, you know, in the 1990s. It did not have the reputation of you know, of a firm like Goldman Sachs, but it was a scrapey firm, but it had a good reputation, and it was a true, you know, meritocracy. The person that produced or impacted, you know, rose very quickly in that organization, and I thrived there. You know, after Drexel went out of business, I went with a group of people for a very, very short time to Salomon Brothers, by the way, another firm that doesn't exist. But it didn't take. There were 6 of us from Drexel Burnham who went there as a group because Salomon Brothers wanted to really advance in the junk bond business. And we were just all miserable. And so within 1 year, 5 of the 6 of us left. 2 of the 6 of us went to Bear Stearns to try to bolster its business there. And we started to really have some success. The business really went away. Part of the reason Drexel went out of business is in 1990, there was a massive credit contraction. If you go back and you look at the market cap of banks, the market cap of Citibank in 1990 was $4 billion. The market cap of Citibank in 2000 was $250 billion. So a lot happened between 1990 and 2000. But in 1990, credit had been squeezed. The savings and loan industry was going out of business. But by 1991, 92, you know, all that started reversing, and the junk bond business kind of took off. And you know, we built a pretty big business at Bear Stearns. And by the middle of the 1990s, both of us were on the 10-person management committee at Bear Stearns, and so we were among the top 10 people running the firm. And I was 33 years old, and so I really thought I was going to stay at Bear Stearns forever. And I was certainly, you know, at a very young age in a position where I had a big career there. But I started, as I understood the business more, to appreciate its limitations and, you know, the advantages that existed in other businesses. And I had a number of opportunities that came my way during the 1990s, some that were super interesting. I was recruited a number of times, although I never went, by David Rubenstein, who was running Carlyle, to go build a credit business at Carlyle. And certainly if I had done that in the mid-1990s, you know, it would have been a good economic decision. But for some reason, I liked being in a big organization. And so in the late 90s, I started getting recruited, you know, to go to Goldman Sachs. And it happened because I met a partner at Goldman Sachs competing for a deal The deal was to finance Sheldon Adelson in the building of the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. It was a $1.2 billion financing. And I had done a bunch of work in the 1990s financing the development of casino hotels. It was actually a good business because the banks wouldn't lend money. The casino business in the 1980s had really been controlled by the mob, and it was finally cleaned up by the government in the mid-80s, and it was starting to proliferate around the country. And so you could get paid a lot of money to raise this. And Goldman Sachs had stayed away from the business, but by the late 1990s, they were like, we should enter this business. And so we started competing for this business, and I noticed that I had been talking to Sheldon Adelson for 10 years and had a real relationship with him. Goldman Sachs showed up, and they were just Goldman Sachs, and all of a sudden Sheldon Adelson wanted to do business with Goldman Sachs. He aspired, he was a young entrepreneur who aspired to be affiliated with Goldman Sachs. And that was very powerful. I understood it, but it was a very tangible example of it. And so after that transaction, because I spent a lot of time with this gentleman, John Winkelried, who was opposite me. John went on to become co-president of Goldman Sachs. John started recruiting me, and I really spent some time thinking about it, and I really said, I'm committed to this. I like big organizations. I think I do well in a big organizational structure. If you're going to be in this industry and you're going to, this is really what you want to do, career-wise, you might as well play for the Yankees. And I had to take a step back. People viewed it as a step back, but it turned out to be a really good decision for me. Had I not gotten here, if I just gone and worked there for 10 years, it would have been a really good decision. There were a whole variety of reasons that I got exposure to things in a different way when I entered Goldman Sachs, that if I had not chosen to do that, I would have had a very different experience.
And in hindsight, that's easy to kind of think through. At the time, I think people called it shocking when you decided to leave Bear Stearns.
People at Bear Stearns were shocked.
So how?
I was shocked. I lost in the 2 months. In the 2 months that I really wrestled with whether or not to do it, I lost 15 pounds.
So I'll try that.
By the way, I don't recommend serious stress as a weight loss strategy.
Okay.
But it actually is quite effective if you're really stressed out and you're not eating.
Yeah. So that is the third dimension. You said there's a third side to you. We found it.
That's not it.
No. So you say you go and play for the Yankees, and in the early 2000s, it's very clear you are playing for the Yankees. And then the world changes in 2008, 2009. Beyond just the kind of financial impact, which we can read about, and there will be books, many books have already been written on. Could you just describe in personal terms being in this tailspin and seeing an industry essentially implode as it was happening, just from a personal account?
Yeah, I mean, so it was a very interesting time, and it wasn't just the industry was certainly imploding, but the system was imploding. The economic system around the world was imploding. Over time, as this became my career, I spent a lot of time, reading about and studying, systemic risk, systemic failure, kind of the history of finance going back 150, 200 years, trying to really understand, could you ever really have a systemic crisis where the system breaks? And I believed it was a very important, interesting academic exercise. But I actually, in 2007, if we were having a discussion, I'd say you could have severe recession, but the system had the right kind of guardrails around it that the system couldn't actually break. The system broke. And by the way, it just wasn't the industry. The system broke for everybody. And the consequences of that were very, very severe. The narrative is that the banks broke the system. That is a vast oversimplification of what occurred over a long period of time. Whenever there's crisis in financial markets, it comes from buildups over a long period of time. It comes from excessive leverage over a long period of time. And in this case, the banks had a bunch of exposure, and the banks became a significant part of it. And the banks, there were a lot of mistakes made in the context of the way the banks were run and how the industry had evolved. But 2008 was the result of decades of policy toward increasing home ownership and basically creating the tools to allow more people to acquire leverage to own homes in the United States, and then spreading the risk of that home ownership around to investors all over the world. And ultimately, because people really believed that the value of homes in a recession could go down 10 to 20%, but it couldn't go down more, the amount of leverage that was put against that was too great, and ultimately home prices went down a lot more than that. And the system collapsed. And so if you were in the middle of it, I mean, it was horrifying. But it wasn't horrifying because you were at a bank. It was horrifying because you're in the middle of understanding how the financial system works and how it affects everybody. And there wasn't a lot that you could do to control it. It really needed intervention. It needed systemic intervention from governments all over the world, and that's what happened. There's a consequence from that we're still dealing with the after effect of. But it was a mess. And I remember we navigated from a financial perspective, Goldman Sachs navigated that better than almost any institution. From a reputational perspective, especially coming out of it, we navigated it poorly. And there was a lot to learn and all that. But I remember in our firm dealing with our issues, but I also remember as a banker, I remember, and some of this has been written about, this was written about in Barbarians at the Gate, being up in GE's offices in the fall of 2008. GE had $85 billion of commercial paper outstanding, commercial paper being short-term loans, and there was no way that they could refinance all that. And GE, at the end of the day, needed to be bailed out, it needed to be saved, it needed to be recapitalized. And I walked out of that meeting in 2008 and really realized, I got into a car and I made a call and I said, GE's in real trouble. And it was very broad, across anyone that had financial leverage. And it was scary. But we were lucky there were leaders who stepped up and made very, very difficult decisions at great political expense that really had a profound impact on shoring up the system. And that's tough stuff.
So I feel like in my mind that began a chapter of immense change across not just Goldman Sachs, but the entire industry. If it's okay, we'd love to start to dive into that,
Sure.
Kind of that picture. Starting with the change in leadership. So we all know there was an official date that you took office, taking over as CEO. But could you walk us through the moment you were unofficially told that you were going to be the person? And this was to set the stage, it seemed like from the outside, a two-horse race that had a lot of spectators on either side. There was a lot of anticipation of who was going to take the helm of Goldman Sachs going into the 150th year of the firm. What was that like the day you found out?
It was a weird day, that's for sure. We can talk about it a little. We skipped a decade, obviously, and we jumped ahead, which is.
I asked if we could, though, right?
Absolutely, we can. We
only have 55 minutes, so.
Absolutely, we could skip the decade because. But one of the points I want to make that I'm not confused about. There are a lot of reasons why someone gets the opportunity, the privilege to run a firm like Goldman Sachs. One of them is just dumb luck from a timing perspective. And so, we skipped a decade, but one of the things that's important to understand is if Lloyd had decided to retire from after the financial crisis to 2016, I wouldn't have been the CEO. Because of some of the reputational problems the firm had after the financial crisis, there was a point in time when it wasn't clear the board would support Lloyd through all of that. And had the board not chosen to support him through all of that, I would not be the CEO. Lloyd got sick and had lymphoma in 2015. And, I think came close to stepping aside at that point. If that had happened, and he's completely healthy now, but if that had happened, I would have been the CEO. So one of the reasons I had the opportunity to be the CEO is because when Lloyd was ready or the board was ready to transition, I happened to be one of the people who was left and around who could compete for it at that moment in time. And I think that's an important thing. And so I never expected to be the CEO of Goldman Sachs. The odds were always that it would be somebody else, and I loved my job running investment banking. I was thrilled when I became president and co-chief operating officer, but at the time that I became president and co-chief operating officer, I was told that the other guy was ahead of me. He was known by the board. He had been the CFO for a number of years. So I never expected to be the CEO of Goldman Sachs. So for starters, when it actually happened, it that point, I knew that I had a better chance than I thought a year earlier, but it was a little bit of a surprise. And in typical Lloyd way, it was a Thursday afternoon, and my office was, there was a conference room next to his office, and my office was next to the conference room. And when Lloyd wanted to talk to me, he had a tendency, he'd basically go, David! And you could hear out of his office down the hall into my office, or somebody that was sitting, one of the assistants would say, David, Lloyd wants to talk to you. And so, I went waddling down to his office, and I walked into his office, and he said, I've been working with the board, and I've made a decision. You're going to be the next person to run Goldman Sachs. I'm going to have a conversation with Harvey in the next week or two. And I don't know exactly what the timing is, but it's soon, not long. But I just want to let you know, you're going to be the next CEO of Goldman Sachs. And I looked at him and I said, okay, I appreciate the wind-up and the lead-in, and how about, would you like to sit down and chat? I have something important to talk to you about. But, that's the way he was, standing there in front of his desk, with him, kind of sitting at his desk. He told me this, and I kind of said, well, if you don't mind, I just want to absorb this a little. And he said, oh, that's fine. And I said, there's probably going to be some stuff to talk about. He said, oh, yeah, sure, we can talk about it. And I kind of went back to my office and kind of sat down in my chair, and I was kind of like, wow. Wow, this actually really happened. And then my next reaction was, oh my God, did I just catch the bus by the tailpipe? I've got to really absorb, this is really happening. I'm now responsible. I've got to get my mind around this because I wasn't as emotionally prepared for it as I probably should have been. So, that's very open, kind of account as to how I felt. But
Sure.
I was a little scared, to be honest, that first moment. Very quickly after that, you kind of start to get your head around it, and then the excitement starts to build. But it's a humbling moment.
And I want to go back to the kind of thoughts that you felt right afterwards, but you touched for a bit on the role of luck and just the way things worked out. And I feel at the business school, a lot of times we can get over-exact on how we think our careers are going to go. Hearing you share that progression, it's very clear that there are things you can control, and there's just things that aren't going to be in your control. Do you have any advice for us in the audience as we think about graduation coming in June for the second years, making the best decision we have, and then to what extent do you just say, let the hand be dealt and go for it?
Well, it's a journey. It's just one of the things that I'd observe, and I talked a little bit about this, I wasn't as purposeful in my decision about where I was going to work and how I was starting my career or how I was continuing my career as people are today. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it's a journey. And I assume most of the students here, if they're graduate students, are in their mid to late 20s. Is that a fair assumption? Ballpark. So you're in the very early part of your professional journey. And I'm 58 years old. I've got a lot of energy. I'm certainly going to work for a while. But, if you're going to work, and by the way, if you're in your 20s today, chances are you're going to work longer because of progress with respect to health and medicine, et cetera. It might not be a straight line. There might be on and off, et cetera. But you could be working for 50 years. It's a long journey. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to make every decision perfectly. You've kind of got to get on start the journey and enjoy the ride, and not be so worried. One of the little anecdotes, I like to talk about, just to make this example. I have lots of young people that come to me, they want to talk. So I had a young woman come to me who wanted some advice. I had known her for a long time. She had been working at the firm for 3 years, and she comes in and she said, I want some advice. I'm trying to figure out where I should go next and what I should do, next to make sure my career is progressing the way it should. And I said, okay, before we do that, just tell me a couple of things. How do you like your job? Oh, I love it. I'm like, okay, well, that's good. What do you like about it? Work is so incredibly interesting. Every day I'm learning. There's variety in what I'm doing. I said, that's really great. Do you feel like you're really, all the projects you're getting put on, you're learning from every project? Absolutely, I'm learning. How do you like your boss? Oh my God, she's amazing. What a privilege for me to work for a woman who's really taking an interest in me as a young woman in the business. I really feel like I have a rabbi and I'm being mentored. I said, that's really terrific. What about the people you're working with? Oh, it's an incredible group. They become my best friends. We're out on the weekends. We're having a great time. You know, I couldn't have imagined that I'd love everybody I'm working with. And I said, great, you want my advice? Go back to work. What do you mean next? Why does there have to be something next? Just kind of, you're in an incredible place where everything's working really well. Just enjoy it, because I guarantee, okay, it's not always going to be that way. And, you know, the journey is one where, you know, there are times where it's clicking, and there are times when it's not. You know, one of the things that I used to say is that if you wake up 2/3 of the time and you're really happy with your job, you're really lucky and you're in a really good place. But I think there are a lot of people that if they have a bad day, they start saying, okay, what am I going to change? And, you know, that's just not what the journey's all about. You know, get on, enjoy the ride. There are going to be ups and downs. A lot of stuff will be thrown at you. But it's a long journey. And the fulfillment and the success, in my mind, will come from the experiences and the journey, not from thinking that you've got it all figured out.
And so back to the moment of taking over and kind of taking us through the next 6, 12, 18 months now. It's clear that Goldman Sachs is a different Goldman Sachs than it was a generation ago, and will be very different than it will be 5 or 10 years from now. I don't know if you know this, but we were colleagues a few years ago when I interned at Goldman Sachs. Yep. I don't know, you were probably busy. I was very busy, you know, ships crossing in the night.
I'm glad you were busy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They made time for fun too. But you know, my dad actually gave me a bell-bottom suit that was wool and pinstriped for a summer internship, and split in half on the pant legs the first day of the internship, walking into Goldman Sachs. And I got it repaired. Everything was fine. But I remember thinking, the suit doesn't match the time that we're in anymore. And when you took over the firm, you've changed everything from, you know, open meetings and open public investor day to diversity guidelines and principles to a sustainability practice where you plan to put to work $750 billion of capital towards financing, investing, advisory work, towards climate transition, and 9 other themes around financial inclusion. Now, these are really big ideas that we talk about in classrooms and have speakers lecture on, but you've made a point to say these changes are more the must rather than the should. Can you talk about how you see them?
Sure. I think it's important to note, though, I mean, there's no question that as I lead Goldman Sachs, I'm evolving it. You know, I read the press and the storyline around the first year and a half of my tenure, and you know, the press would make it seem like I'm turning the place upside down, and I'm really not. But like any organization, the reason Goldman Sachs has been around for 150 years is because it always evolves, it always changes, it always figures out what it needs to be relevant and successful. And any organization has to do that to survive and thrive. You know, I think there's a natural arc with any leader of an organization that when you're a new leader of an organization, you kind of look at the facts, the set of facts you have, you know, what you have, and you say, okay, based on what I've got, what's the right set of things to do to move the organization forward and have the best relative performance that you can. When you're later in your tenure, you get much more defensive and protecting of your legacy. And so it's not surprising, Lloyd ran the firm for over 12 years, that he wasn't looking for significant change, you know, in the last 4 or 5 years. And so, you know, I'm looking for more change because it's my job to evolve it. The big thing I'm trying to evolve with Goldman Sachs is that the things we talked about in the financial crisis changed the world. If you go back 20 years in the United States, there were 6 or 7 big banks that had global aspirations, and there were 5 investment banks in the United States that had global aspirations. Goldman Sachs was the largest of those 5 investment banks dealing with institutional clients, really, governments and institutions, corporations and institutions. The financial crisis kind of changed everything. Well, 2 things changed in the last 20 years. First was the unwinding of Glass-Steagall, which allowed the banks that served consumer customers to get into investment banking businesses, going back to the depression in the 1920s, or in the early 30s when Glass-Steagall was created, those things were separated. And the second thing that happened is coming out of the crisis, investment banks went away and everybody became a bank. So some investment banks literally went away, but the remaining investment banks, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, became banks. So now, instead of 6 or 7 banks and 5 investment banks, there are 6 big banks that have global ambitions. And Goldman Sachs is the smallest of those 6 banks. And its business mix, which is still heavily investment banking business, that business is a really, really good business, but it's not growing. And so if you're running a public company, you have to grow. And so the biggest thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get Goldman Sachs growing again. That's the #1 priority. And I have us entering and expanding a number of businesses to get us growing. But the second thing I'm trying to do is, I think part of the secret sauce of our organization is the quality of the people that we're able to attract to the organization. And I think to ensure that or protect that for another generation or another couple of decades, the firm has to be different than it's been. It was very closed, it was very private, it was very secretive, it was very steadfast in its ways, it wasn't open. And I've been trying very hard to make it a much more modern organization that I think can continue to be a magnet for talent in a different, in a different world. And so, yes, I'm trying to do things that I think matter, but I'm also trying to make the organization, more open and accessible, because I think it'll make Goldman Sachs better. Now, in the context of that, and we talked a little bit, earlier when we were talking about purpose in business. When you talk about something like sustainability, one of the things I've come to appreciate is I'm running this organization where we can do things that really have an impact not just on the organization, but on the community more broadly. And it's important, I think, for us to really be focused on things that we think are necessary, where we can make a difference. And I think we're in a position where when you think about sustainability as a broad topic, whether it's the environment, whether it's affordable and accessible healthcare, whether it's more inclusive economic opportunity, broadly, these are things that Goldman Sachs is in a position to help advance. And I think it's important that we try to use our resources to do it. And so I'm trying to make sure we're very thoughtful and purpose-driven in using our resources, our assets, which are really our people, our capital, our technology, to drive not just at serving our clients and ultimately driving performance in our business, but ultimately having an impact on society more broadly. And I think that matters, and I think if we do that right, it will help our relative performance. I think it's good for business.
There is a business case for that.
There's a strong business case for it.
So we're going to go to questions in a few minutes. I want to ask, just in these last couple minutes, about you.
Okay.
We touched a lot on the one version of David Solomon. We haven't gotten so much of DJ D. Saul. A few years ago, I was working on a book project around people's outside passions at work. And I'd heard you were a DJ. I really wanted to hear your story. And at the time, the powers that be, kind of created some space, and there was a polite kind of, this isn't something we want to kind of open up to talk about. Now, that's something you lead with. You bring that identity, this passion as part of who you are to work, or at least to who you are each day.
Well, everybody else brings it. I show up at work ready to with my Goldman Sachs suit on.
Right.
But it's interesting how it is now a public part of me that goes wherever I go.
And I'd love to know how that feels. And there's so much support. There's people saying, oh, that's great, you're able to do this. And it just seems like that's who you are. Genuinely, from what I can tell, that's a part of you. But what's changed, and why now can you bring that to the surface?
Well, so the first thing, the first thing I need to just talk about a little bit is just 2 minutes on how I became a DJ.
Sure.
Because I haven't been a DJ for 40 years. I've always loved music. I've always been hugely into music, but I became a DJ. It goes back a little bit to the Las Vegas story. Because I was involved in financing a bunch of these buildings, I was having a conversation, in Las Vegas in 2008 about the changing economic model of a bunch of these buildings. Clubs were becoming a huge economic engine. Gambling was diminishing. restaurants and clubs were becoming a huge economic engine, and the amount of money that was being made in these clubs was astronomical, and I didn't really understand the economic model. And so I went down into a club that was called Tryst at the Wynn and was shown around. It's now called Intrigue for those of you who go to Las Vegas now. I went down to kind of understand the model. This was the beginning of bottle service. You know, house music and club music and electronic dance music were really exploding, and DJs were starting to get paid a lot of money. And I went down to see the business model, but I loved the music. And I started finding myself listening to house music and listening to electronic dance music, which was a genre of music I knew nothing about. And in 2010, I asked a guy named Scott Greenstein, who is the president of SiriusXM. I said, I want to learn about house music. I want to learn about electronic dance music. How can I learn about it? And he introduced me to a guy named Paul Oakenfold, who will be known to many of you. Paul Oakenfold is you know, a long time DJ who really is kind of the godfather of, you know, this genre of music going back to the late 80s in Ibiza, in London, in the West Village, in the East Village in New York. And he's in his 50s, and he lives in Los Angeles. And I went out and had a drink with him in 2010, and we hit it off, talking about music, talking about life, talking about business. We hit it off. And Paul said to me, I should teach you how to DJ. And I said, well, that would be cool. And I said, how do I do that? And he said, he wrote down, you go buy these things, and you know, I'll send you some music, and I'll start teaching you how to DJ. And so I started playing around with it, put it on my dining room table, and started playing around with it, you know, on the weekends, just for fun. And he would send me music, and after a year or two, I was like, I want to learn more. Introduced me to somebody in New York, and he introduced me to a DJ, a guy named Todd Wilkinson, who goes by Liquid Todd. If any of you listen to 51 BPM, you know Liquid Todd, because he's a regular on BPM. And he started coming to my apartment on Sundays and teaching me how to mix music. I played the saxophone in elementary school and through high school, so I could read music. I understood music theory, understood basic key theory. And so, you know, he started teaching me, and this went on Sunday afternoons. Not all Sunday afternoons, but on Sunday afternoons for a number of years. And about 5-6 years ago, Paul was coming to New York to play at Marquee, and he called me and he said, hey, I hear you're getting pretty good. You know, do you want to do an hour at Marquee? And I had never DJ'd anywhere but my dining room. And I said, well, I can't do that. And he said, yes, you can. Pick 10 tracks. You'll mix them together. And he said, don't worry about it. It'll be from 11 to 12 when the club opens. There won't be anyone there anyway. And so I went and I did it, and he was right. At 11 o'clock, my kids were there, but there wasn't really anybody else there. But by 12 o'clock, it was quite full, and I was hooked. I mean, my adrenaline, I had a rush, you know, from doing it. And so I started doing it. You know, my friends knew, but on Saturday nights, you know, I'd go to places, you know, in the East Village where they'd let me play. You know, they'd pay me. I'd just like, can I play for a couple hours? And they'd let me play, and I played, and you know, it was a hobby. And I kept working on it and got better at it, but I really, you know, except privately, nobody knew. Shortly after I became president of the firm, years ago,
which happens to most DJs.
Yeah. I was playing in a place in New York City, and a reporter from the New York Times, you know, saw it and wrote it. Kate Kelly, you probably Googled it up there. Kate Kelly wrote about it, and you know, so it was then out. And I was describing earlier, when we were talking earlier, to a small group here, my first reaction when I heard it was going to be in the paper, I was horrified. I was like, well, what's everybody think? How is this going to affect me? But then Lloyd did something, you know, very, very nice. He tweeted, you know, the same day he tweeted out, sometimes David really needs to let down his hair. And, which by the way is very, very hard for me. It was a way of him saying, you know, it's okay that he's doing this. It's okay. And, you know, that led me to really thinking about it and saying, okay, I really like this. This is really fun. I'm enjoying this. I'm going to keep doing it. But I then said, if I'm going to keep doing it, I got to get better. And if you want to get better, you've got to produce music. So I started taking lessons around producing, and I started producing. And as it's just evolved, it's become a thing. And I had no expectation. You know, Jennifer was talking earlier. I had no expectation that this was going to be anything other than a hobby, and it is, just to be clear, a hobby. But now it's a hobby where actually, I have a platform where I'm getting paid and I'm giving it away to charity. I'm doing something good with it. And that's really terrific. But there's been a whole bunch of stuff that's come out of it. And this is really what gets to what you're talking about that I just never expected. The first is it's changed the way I'm perceived at Goldman Sachs in a positive way. And the simplest example that I can give is I was running investment banking for 10 years at Goldman Sachs. I've been on the management committee at Goldman Sachs for 15 years. I walked around that building, and Goldman Sachs is a very young organization. 60% of the people who work at Goldman Sachs are 30 years old or less. 74% of the people who work at Goldman Sachs are millennial or Gen Z, so 37 years old or younger. I would walk around that building, nobody would talk to me. I'd be in the elevator, and I would walk into the elevator with a bunch of young people, and I'd say, hey, how's it going? And they'd be like, fine. Looking at their shoes. And I don't think I'm that scary and intimidating, but I walk around that building now, everybody stops me and wants to talk to me. I'm in the lobby getting coffee, people want to talk to me. And they usually start in that they want to talk about music. And then 2 minutes later, we're talking about business or we're talking about the firm. But it humanized me in, I think, a positive way. And I think it humanizes the firm. And by the way, it's just not about me. It's allowing other people at the firm to be their authentic selves, to bring their authentic selves to work. And I think it's a better way for the organization to be. But I stumbled into this, and I'm learning as I go. But it's really changing my perception of what a modern leader needs to be, and how we need to be if we want to lead people in a modern world. And by the way, people are different. When I started, I was with a group of people yesterday, and I talked about this. When I started, if someone said jump, I said how high. Okay, I know that if I say jump today at Goldman Sachs and I'm talking to an employee in their 30s, they do not say how high. They start by saying, well, let's discuss, why you want me to jump, and why is jumping good for Goldman Sachs, and why is jumping good for me, and how is jumping going to advance my career? And personally, I'm not a jumper, I'm a skipper, because skipping really makes me feel fulfilled and relevant. And so could we talk about whether for me to succeed at Goldman Sachs, is it really necessary for me to jump, or can I be successful as a skipper, in your organization? I mean, that's the way the world's really evolved. And I understand that, but I mean, it's, people wore shoes with laces, I wore shoes with laces. I hated shoes with laces. They'd always get untied, you're always tying them. But that's what other people, you mirrored yourself after the people you worked with. Today, people are much more their own self. They're an individual. People can express. Everybody used to wear suits. All the suits looked the same. Whether men or women, they were suits. Everybody dressed exactly the same. You walk around Goldman Sachs, and everybody's dressing the way they want to dress, the way they think is appropriate for their job, their day, their experience. One of the things I got credit for in the last year and a half was changing the dress code. It's really that based. By the way, there was more press articles written when we announced that the dress code was officially changed than there were articles written about me becoming the CEO of the firm. And the reason I did it is I was walking around looking at the firm, and everybody in the firm was dressed casually, except for a very small number of people. And I asked for the dress code. This was like the first month I was the CEO. I said, can I see the dress code? Because I knew one existed. I got a 35-page document that had been put together, years ago. And I looked at it, and none of it fit what the firm was. And so we wrote a one-paragraph memo, 2 sentences that basically said, dress in a way that's appropriate for your day, for your clients, for your work, for your experience. We all know what's appropriate. We all know what's not appropriate in a workplace. Be appropriate. And I just codified something that society had changed over a long period of time, and the firm had naturally evolved to. But the fact that we hadn't said that, if you were a young person coming from Stanford and starting your first day at Goldman Sachs, you would be super worried about what you needed to wear. And there was no reason for you to be worried about that, because the world and the organization had progressed. Yeah. And so it was important to basically codify that and say, this is the way we dress at Goldman Sachs, this is what matters. And that got thousands of newspaper articles. I mean, it's a little bit more visibility than we need, and a little bit of fake news along the way.
Well, I appreciate the candor. I really do. I think as much as we joke about the different versions of you, I think you have shared, the DNA that you bring to the office to DJing, so I appreciate that. And I think we have time very quickly for a couple questions that we have from the audience. So
Sure.
go there, right.
I'm Chen Yu, MBA 1. So my question is that Goldman is a global bank, and obviously you guys are involved in many emerging markets, and some of the emerging markets have governance problem. Like for Goldman's case, it's in Malaysia. So I was wondering, what's your take on Goldman's emerging market strategy with like sufficient governance in mind going forward?
Sure. So as many of you know, we're involved in a situation in Malaysia that's been very reputationally damaging to the firm, that we're trying to work through and we're trying to resolve. We did a bunch of financing for the Malaysian government back in 2012, 2013. And after the financing was done, the prime minister at the time, Prime Minister Najib, along with a gentleman named Joe Low, stole a significant amount of the money that we had raised and other money that was in their version of a sovereign wealth fund. And two people who worked at Goldman Sachs, after the fact, got involved in the movement of that money, the laundering of that money around the world, and committed, overt criminal actions. And so, when you run an organization with 40,000 people, unfortunately, sometimes people do bad things, but we own that, and that's our responsibility. And so there are obviously consequences for the firm because of that. I think to your point, one of the things that you have to step back and you have to recognize is that when you do business in these emerging economies, a bunch of the things that we take for granted in places like the United States don't exist. And I think our view on this has evolved a little bit over time. I think 10 years ago, we really thought, our job was to make capital accessible anywhere in the world. And as long as it was done in a way where you were providing capital and access to capital, that would obviously better economic participation. The world has long forgotten that in 2009, 2010, 2011, President Obama was playing golf with Prime Minister Najib. President Obama was visiting Malaysia. President Obama was talking about how it was important that we did business with Malaysia and supported Malaysia. That's all now, history. In these emerging markets, the standards around rule of law, corruption, are different. And so our bar in doing business in these places has to be higher. And I think our experience in Malaysia has raised the bar. That doesn't mean that we won't do business with governments in these emerging economies, but the bar to do business and the filter to do it is going to be higher. It has to be, because the reputational damage when something goes wrong is it's bad. It's not worth it. And so I think it's changed our lens. Now we still do business in all these places, but I think we limit it to some degree, and I think the aperture and looking at that's changed over the last decade.
Okay, time for one more question.
Hey David, my name is Mark Bush. I'm a first year student here at the GSB. You're known for spearheading a lot of initiatives targeted at improving a junior banker experience at GS. Can you talk a little bit about what's next on your agenda to keep attracting top talent?
So I talked a little bit about this. The secret sauce at Goldman Sachs is the people. And one of the things I'm incredibly proud of, and I see it every day. I see it every day through the experience I get working with people at Goldman Sachs. And I see it every day as I travel around and meet with our clients, all over the world, to talk about the quality of our people. We have extraordinary people in our organization. It is an extraordinary organization from a talent perspective, and we have to keep that. That is a lot more complicated in 2020 than it was, 20 or 30 years ago. And so it requires, one, creating an environment that people want to work in and want to be a part of. It requires enormous investment, in people and training and development, of people. It requires having an organization where people can move around and have different experiences. So there's strong incentives when you want to have other experiences in your career to stay in the organization rather than look outside the organization. And it requires having an organization where the rewards, both the psychic rewards, but also the economic rewards and the wealth creation rewards, are super competitive. And so we focus on all of that all the time. There isn't a specific thing that I can say to you, this is the next thing we're going to do that adds to this. But You know, what you talked about in terms of junior bankers, it gives you a sense of my mindset and you know, how I think about things. When things have to evolve, sometimes you have to take a risk to change them. You have to do something that the initial response or the initial reaction is going to be, well, that's crazy, we can't do that. And that, what you're talking about with junior bankers, is a great example of that. Just to, you know, to tell the group, you know, when I got out of school and I started to work, you know, as a young person in the business, work was defined by the fact that you worked very, very hard, but the minute you walked out of the office, until you walked back into the office, you really were free and unreachable. Yes, somebody could call you on your home phone, but you didn't have to answer it. You could let the answering machine pick up, even if you were home. You could screen your calls on the answering machine. There's some in the audience that remember answering machines. And so you might have worked very, very hard, but if you walked out of the office, you know, at 10 o'clock at night, you know, you knew until you walked back in the next day, and maybe you didn't walk back in the next day until 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, you're unreachable. And the world moved at a different pace. Life changed, and everybody expects 24/7, you know, response time. And if you're coming out of school and you're a young person and you're going to work and you're working in an environment where everybody's texting and emailing and everybody expects you to be connected, you have no experience, you have no guardrails, you have no parameters for how you're supposed to manage that. And it takes an exceptionally confident young person to realize that you actually aren't expected to work all the time. You're expected to have boundaries. And so we came up with the idea of creating boundaries. And we said, what's a reasonable amount of time that someone should work when you're young and you're starting out in the business? And we came up with, you know, 70 hours. You know, it was a pretty full week. And I know that sounds like a lot, but if you think about that, you're young, you come in, you work from 9 to 9, that's 12 hours, and, you know, you probably put in, you know, 5 hours a day on the weekend, or 10 hours, you know, one day on the weekend. It doesn't all have to be in the office, but in the competitive world, that actually is, you know, the way people work. And we thought about that, and we said, okay, that feels like a lot. Is that sustainable? And we said, you know what? That's probably not as sustainable as we'd like it to be. Let's target 65. And we thought about that, and we said, we think we can make that work in some way, shape, or form, but we're going to track it. And so we started tracking how much every young person was working. We could track it because we knew when they walked in the building, we knew when they left the building. And we started tracking it. We started keeping track of this. And this was done in investment banking, you know, where the hours are the hardest. Well, what we found out is, despite what everybody said, okay, the average person was actually working less than 65 hours. Okay, the average person was working about 59 or 60 hours over the course of a week. There were definitely outliers. But the curve, if you want to look at the bell curve, it was very wide, okay, in terms of, you know, very few people working less than 55 or 60 hours, but there were very few people working more than 65 or 70 hours. And so we basically said, let's try to moderate this. Let's create a rule that work is done Sunday morning from 9 o'clock in the morning till Friday night at 9 o'clock. And we'll give you some guidelines as to how much we think you should work, but we're going to close the office from 9 o'clock on Friday to 9 o'clock on Sunday, except by exception, because of course there are going to be some things that will create exception. And you've got to get exception from a partner of the firm to be asked to work during that period of time. And people said we were crazy. And I said, well, let's try it for 6 months and let's see what happens. And we tried it, and you know what? It generally worked. We basically got to the point that between every weekend there were kind of 5 to 7% exceptions, but generally speaking, people knew they could plan. And we started tracking, and we found that people were working 60 to 65 hours a week. And we got to a place where people felt a lot better about it. But it was a bold thing to try because it was kind of upsetting the apple cart. And it's a great example of when something's not working right or the societal change has changed the way things work, try something different and recognize you might fail, it might not work, but you'll learn something and then you can try something again. And so when we think about, you know, talent in the organization, we think a lot about, you know, how to find ways to make the place, you know, really, really exceptional. And we'll continue to think about that.
So to wrap up, we have a tradition called the lightning round, where we ask a series of quick questions. Usually they warrant maybe a one-word answer. I thought it'd be fun to maybe twist the game a little bit to play towards your music interests. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay, perfect. So I was going to name, or I will name, a situation where you would probably turn music on for. So something like going to the gym. And I want to kind of go inside your soundtrack of what is the first song that comes to mind as I name a situation. Does that sound good?
Sure. I don't know if I'll be able to play exactly by your rules, but I'll try.
I just made up the rules. You can change them if you want. So, okay, so heading into the shower right when you wake up, you're getting ready for work in the morning. What comes on?
CNBC.
That's fair. Any commercial music in there? Or? Okay, yeah, well, there's no wrong answers here.
Go listen to the start. Go listen to the start of CNBC. CNBC has music. In fact, CNBC's even played some of my music. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, and when I heard it, I was shocked. But,
So you're going in. You're in the workplace. You're about to have a difficult conversation.
Now you're in the shower.
Well, no, you've made it to work. Did you listen to any music on the way to work? Is there a song that comes up?
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, if I'm on the way to work, I'm generally, I get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I work out. I turn on CNBC, I work out, and usually, I'm heading, out the door, at 7:15, 7:30 in the morning. But I really haven't, outside of when I wake up at 6 o'clock, looking at my phone and making sure I don't have a text message from my kids overnight that something terrible is going on. I don't look at my phone until I'm done working out. And I'm on my way to the office. So generally when I get into the car, I'd like to put some music on, but instead I'm kind of looking at my phone and making sure that before I get into my first meeting at 8 o'clock, anything that has to be dealt with overnight is dealt with.
Got
no music in the car.
In the car.
Okay.
All right, now we're at the office. Any music you play as you're going to go into what you think will be a difficult conversation?
In my head?
In your head. What's the pump-up music?
Well, I mean, if I'm playing one of my tracks, it could be "Feel Alive." But look, I'm not supposed to say "look." Music's running through my head all day, but it's not like this song associated with this with that. If you looked at my phone, I have 350 playlists on my phone, and there are probably about 15,000 tracks of music. If you look at the playlists are all bunched by an experience, by a place, by a time, by a thing. And so, there's style. If you really want to get excited, I've got a bunch of kind of heavy EDM bangers going through my head. Tiesto Grapevine, just when I said that, Tiesto Grapevine ran through my head. And so, it's not like I associate one song with the experience. It's like, what are you in the mood for? Do you want to bang? Do you want to groove? Do you want to relax? Do you want to go deeper?
Yep.
I mean, it's, what's the moment? But one of the things I do, and I know I'm way off your lightning round, and so
the game has no rules.
I'm rambling in my direction.
No.
What I do is I'm constantly sent music now, every single day. And so when I get a 5-minute break in the office where I'm kind of like, okay, what do I do next? If you walk by my office, sometimes you'll find that I'm listening to tracks that are being sent to me that are new music that's not released. And so, I'm constantly during the day, during any given day, I probably listen to 5 to 10 new tracks of music that aren't released, that I've never heard, that somebody's trying to get somebody to pick up and produce.
So that brings me to the last question. We're going to play a song on the way out of here in just a few minutes that you're releasing on Friday.
Yes.
New track. How would you describe it in one word?
It's a commercial. One word. You can't
okay, fine. One sentence.
It's a commercial house dance track. It's a commercial house dance track. It's something. It's a genre that you'd hear on 51 on BPM on Sirius XM.
Awesome. David Solomon, DJ D-Sol, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you all.